This is the Lightning Junkies podcast with your host, Chaz Cryptoson. On this episode of the podcast, we have Ruben Somsen, founder of the Seoul Bitcoin Meetup, co-host of the Unhashed Podcast, and the author of the Statechains idea. In this 10th episode of the podcast, we discuss state chains, how they relate to Lightning, Eltoo, and much more. I think with Ruben being a fellow podcast person, it made this a very conversational podcast, something that's a bit newer for me, but I think something that you as a listener will quite enjoy. Before we jump into the episode, I do just want to remind you about my crowdfunding campaign. If you take anything away from this podcast, please consider chipping in Bitcoin, either on-chain or over the Lightning Network, at crowdfund.lightningjunkies.net. If you want to tip me with tipping.me or BottlePay, or maybe even LNCast, you can find those links in the show notes. Starting sometime next week, anyone that pledges over 100,000 Satoshis will also be getting a Lightning Junkies sticker. If you do end up doing that, please make sure to email me or otherwise contact me so I can follow up for sending out your sticker to you. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this episode. I would like to go ahead and welcome Ruben to the Lightning Junkies podcast. How are you doing this evening?
Hey, I'm doing fine, thanks.
Absolutely. Let's go ahead and jump into things here. Could you let me know your background before we jump into the Bitcoin stuff?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of started off as a meetup organizer. So I've been in Seoul for, running the Seoul Bitcoin Meetup since February 2014. So quite a while. I started off just kind of, being excited about Bitcoin, learning about it, and wanting to talk to other people. And I didn't really see any other meetups in the area, so I just kind of decided to start one. I would say that was, for me, kind of the way in which I also learned about it by talking to other people and kind of trying to explain to them the things that I learned by reading stuff online. And especially at the time, it was very difficult to learn kind of details about how Bitcoin works. And a lot of stuff was still being figured out. And, I would take a week trying to understand a little detail. And then, at the meetup, I could explain it to, dozens of people. And I would say that's kind of, I'd say teaching. And that's kind of a secret that people that don't really teach, they don't really know. But the teacher learns the most. It really is kind of a way for you to digest information. And only once you can explain it to other people in a way that they really get it, you have kind of a good model, mental model in your head. And I'd say slowly, just by doing that over the years, I started to kind of become able to actually contribute back to Bitcoin and be active on the mailing list and add some of my own ideas. And I would say Statechains is kind of the culmination of that, because it really is a bunch of different techniques that other people came up with that initially I was just looking into because I thought it was fascinating. And I put them all together in kind of a new novel way. And that is, the layer 2 idea that's called Statechains.
Absolutely. So to me, it kind of sounds like you had some influences from Richard Feynman, maybe.
Richard Feynman, not particularly, no.
Okay, fair enough. Because his big thing was just, you learn the most by teaching and kind of filling in the gaps,
I
stuff
see,
like that.
yeah.
But anyway, so would you say that you kind of got your start in Bitcoin through the meetups, or was there a bit of a background before that?
I would say that's where I got my start. I would say I've always been kind of a learning junkie. So the way I approached Bitcoin, I would say, is, I guess, very typical of what I do, which is really going deep and into the weeds and figuring out all the stuff. And I felt, particularly with Bitcoin, just the more I understood about the system, the more I realized how important it is to really understand it, because you can't really be a Bitcoiner without having some kind of understanding of the system, because otherwise, why do you choose Bitcoin and why not some other altcoin? And the answer to that question is inherently technical. So for me, I kind of felt like, hey, I'm, organizing these Bitcoin meetups and there are all these other coins around, but do I really understand why Bitcoin is, the one that makes sense and all the others don't? And yeah, I think just my eagerness to figure out answers to those questions. And I guess I'm generally, I like technical stuff. I do. I'm not a programmer, but I do hobby programming. So it kind of just led me through that path, and yeah, it was fascinating.
All right. I've definitely heard of the Seoul Bitcoin Meetup, kind of just, talking to people, hearing about things, and a lot of the different meetups throughout the world are very unique and have their own kind of thing kind of going for it. What would you say would be the unique thing about the Seoul Bitcoin Meetup?
It depends on like what angle you take, but compared to other Bitcoin meetups, I would say we are long running. We've been doing this for a long time. We kind of, over time, I think we kind of learned what was a good way of doing it. And what we settled on is kind of monthly meetups that are open to everybody and weekly technical meetups for people that are really willing to dive deep. And, the problem is kind of that you have these two audiences, right? You have these, people that are just interested superficially. And I think those, that's fine too, but those are not really the people that are going to take the time to really learn it in detail. So I try to kind of like have events for both. And that way kind of, we end up with these groups of people that really want to learn a lot and people that just kind of like casually learn a little bit about Bitcoin.
Got it. Do you think that the meetup kind of caters to one particular crowd, or do you think it does a good job of kind of catering to the kind of both of the ones you mentioned here?
Well, I'd say these days people kind of know what Bitcoin is. So I've been feeling more and more that we need to focus more on the technical side of things. And that's also where my passion lies. So I would say over time, the meetup has definitely been transitioning into more of a developer focused kind of high level technical meetup. But yeah, at the same time, like I think that the trick is to get new people to still come in, right? Because what happens with meetups, especially if you're technical and if you have the same crowd coming every time, then it's very difficult for a newcomer to kind of come in and be comfortable and learn the basics because nobody's talking about the basics anymore. So that's kind of the one thing I would say to anyone who tries to organize meetups is try to have some kind of window, even if it's once every 3 months or whatever. Try to have a window where newcomers can kind of be guided into that core.
So like I'm definitely aware that, during the bull market, the meetups were kind of like overflowing with the kind of newbies or the tourists or, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But definitely in the bear market, I'm not quite sure if that's the case. What has your observations been as far as kind of newbies kind of coming into the meetups here?
Well, I wouldn't say like, I mean, there are definitely more newbies during a bull market, but I think depending on like who finds your platform or like in this case, we're using meetup.com. There was always going to be people that are just curious and they just show up. Like I would say 9 out of 10 people, they're not going to be there every week and going deep. And maybe that's also particularly because we're in South Korea. And I would say there's less of an open source kind of free learning attitude here. So people don't really want to invest time in something that doesn't obviously relate to a job. So that kind of plays into it as well. But yeah, you really you get both. I think regardless of whether it's a bull market or a bear market.
All right. I just wanted to move on a little bit here. I was kind of doing a little bit of research on you here, and I saw that you actually have your own podcast as well. Do you want to tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's called Unhashed Podcast, and it's basically me and 3 other guys, the Bill Photo guys, Brian and Colin, and Mario, who is well, they're all friends, but Mario, he's kind of got his start at the Seoul Bitcoin Meetup as well, but he moved to Canada, and yeah, so that's kind of a podcast where we both go through the news and try to also be technical, but kind of at a a very beginner conscious level. And, it's a little bit more of a fun podcast where we make some jokes, and I would definitely recommend you check it out. And it's a fun podcast, and it's fun to do.
Have there been any recent episodes that are, especially stand out or especially good episodes you might recommend to a person listening for the first time?
So we recently did an interview with Hasu about the kind of the mining rewards dwindling and how to handle that in the future. That was a very interesting episode where it was quite technical. I'd say that's kind of a different kind of episode from what we usually do because it was really an interview and we were focused on the guest. But that's a great episode, and just generally, if you want to learn some more technical details about mining. I thought it was great. Then episode 54 was pretty good. It was me and Colin rocking it. That's just kind of more of an average episode, I'd say, where fun episode, and you kind of get an idea of like what we're usually up to.
Got it. Okay. So before you kind of mentioned the state chains thing, and I think that's like the primary reason why I wanted to kind of have a talk with you here.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us a quick synopsis of what state chains are, and then we can kind of dive deeper here?
Yeah. So yeah, let's get into it. I assume that's what everybody's listening for.
Right.
So basically, I would say, the first thing I think that's important to kind of get into is layer 2 and why it matters, and what we're kind of trying to achieve here. So we've got this Bitcoin blockchain, and really it doesn't scale in the sense that every time, if I want to send you some money, I sent you this transaction, the transaction goes to the Bitcoin blockchain, and everybody has to verify that transaction. And not just everybody that's running a node today, but even everybody that's running a node in the future. And that's just kind of insane when you think about it, right? Like just me and you sending a transaction and then everybody having to check it. So that's really the scaling issue that is trying to be solved, things like Lightning. And I would say Lightning is a great solution. It's probably the most kind of true to Bitcoin solution in the sense that it is really trustless in a sense, but it does have constraints, new constraints, which are kind of throughput and routing issues. You have to have these channels, you have to have these routes, and there has to be sufficient liquidity in these routes. And if there's not, then you are kind of forced back on chain. So that's I would say kind of the Lightning limitation. And despite that being a limitation, it's still incredibly useful and incredibly important. So there, that's kind of the I'd say the most trustless layer 2 system. But on the other side of the spectrum, you also have something like Coinbase, and people don't really commonly think of Coinbase as a layer 2, but we can both have a Coinbase account, and I can send you some money through Coinbase. It doesn't have to hit the blockchain because it's all Coinbase central server taking care of it, and that is a way to also scale transactions because basically only Coinbase needs to settle every once in a while with BitPay or whatever other payment provider, and that would be like one huge transaction, and that's one way of scaling Bitcoin. But obviously, this is like the as far as possible removed from what we're trying to achieve here with Bitcoin, because now you're back to just trusting this entity, and if they say no, well, then you lose all your coins, right? They can just confiscate it. They can do whatever they want. The intermediate solution to that is something called sidechains or federated sidechains specifically. And at a high level, it really is just kind of a multi-sig of a bunch of parties instead of one party. So instead of just trusting Coinbase, you might say, okay, we'll trust Coinbase and BitPay and a couple of exchanges. And this is what, for instance, Blockstream is doing with Liquid. And this is an interesting model in the sense that now you are trusting a bunch of these parties, but you're trusting so many of them, and you're kind of trusting that they don't collude and get together and screw you over like that. And this kind of adds some trust, but there are still some limitations here. And I would say state chains are kind of a in the middle solution where it veers a little bit more towards Lightning, but it still kind of relies on this idea of a federation. But what it's trying to do at a high level is removing as much power as possible from the third parties that you're trusting. So you've got this federation, you've got these people that are signing on your behalf. But with state chains, you're giving them as little power and knowledge as possible. So the first way this is done is through basically blind signatures. So that means that you're locking up your money with this federation, but they can't actually see what money is yours. So you basically you ask them for a key, and then you send some money to that key and a key of your own. But because you never tell them that you actually sent money to it, and you never kind of give them any proof of where that transaction appears on the Bitcoin blockchain, they don't actually know that they have your money. So that's kind of the first step. And despite them not knowing, they can actually act like a sidechain in the sense that they do control the money, but they just don't know it. So the second step is to actually make the so-called peg out the default. So the weakness of a sidechain is that you basically have to ask permission when you want to get out. So you have to contact the federation, and you have to say, hey, please give me my coins back. And then they have to sign a transaction, and that transaction goes to the Bitcoin blockchain, and now you have your coins. So with state chains, the peg out, getting out of the federation is the default. Whenever you move the money, or whenever a new owner receives the money, they actually receive an off-chain transaction that they can send to the Bitcoin blockchain at any time. So if the federation disappears, you can still get your money. This really kind of improves the security model in the sense that with a sidechain, what happens is if 1/3 decides not to sign, then your money is basically frozen. Whereas with a state chain, you can actually have it up to 100%. So only if they all get together and they all collude, then they can take your money. But as long as even just one of them is honest, then the worst thing they can do is kind of force you on chain. So you have to send your off chain transaction to the Bitcoin blockchain, and you get your money back. So from that perspective, it's a lot more secure. And yeah, I would say those are really the kind of the core features. And I guess one more is that they can't actually take your money unless they somehow acquire a secret from one of the users. So what kind of happens is there are two keys, and one key is with the users and one key is with the federation. And the key of the users could get leaked. Like if the federation really tries, they could get the key. But if they behave and they act normally and they don't actually actively try to cheat, then they would never actually obtain that key. And the reason that's important is because let's say the federation wants to be honest, but a regulator comes to them and says, hey, you're engaged in this illegal activity. So first of all, because of the blind signatures, they would not actually be aware that they're engaged in illegal activity. But let's say it gets shown to them and they're like, oh, okay, yeah. So then the second thing is, if they're asked to confiscate the money, they can't actually do it unless they have that secret from the users. Yeah, so that really kind of makes it, from a regulatory perspective, kind of interesting, because now the question really is like, are they actually controlling any money? Because they only have one of the if let's say you consider that 2 of 2, they only have one of the two keys. And that really begs the question, like, who controls the money?
Absolutely. So I guess I wasn't aware of the kind of privacy implications there, that it could be a lot more obfuscated than what I maybe kind of naively thought here.
Yeah, so it's I think the confusion here, or the thing that is confusing, is that there's the users having privacy from the federation, and then there is kind of a obfuscation of knowledge that allows the federation to act in a way where they can't be held responsible for holding the money because they actually don't have the information about it. So really, from the perspective of the federation, all they're doing is a user comes to them and asks them to sign a thing. And they don't know what the thing is, but they just sign it. And that's all they do. And while they're doing that, they're actually sending money, but they're not aware of it.
Got it. Okay, so let's kind of go take a step back here, because I just kind of wanted to make it something that I'm kind of curious, kind of clear here.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding correctly, what's happening here is rather than kind of like in the Lightning Network where you're moving HTLCs around, you're kind of trading entire UTXOs. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that is correct. So in order to kind of achieve the added security and the added obfuscation, there is a trade-off, and the trade-off is essentially that you're dealing with entire UTXOs. So with a sidechain, you just give the money to the federation, and you can split it up in any way you want, and then you just ask them to give it back to you. But with this model, because you have to have this kind of off-chain transaction, it has to be linked to a specific UTXO, and that specific UTXO means that really you can only trade the entire amount. So yeah, that is the main limitation, and there are ways to get around that, which among others are the Lightning Network, which is why Statechains and the Lightning Network they're a really good pair. They really work together really well.
Let's jump into that a bit there. So, let's say, we had state chains going. How could I kind of use that in, would I be using it with a Lightning Network or would I be using it in some other fashion?
Yeah, so because of this limitation of sending entire UTXOs, you really run into this issue where, let's say I have a 1 Bitcoin UTXO, but I owe you 0.9 Bitcoin, for instance. So there are two ways you can deal with that. The first way is to try to find somebody who has a 0.1 and a 0.9 UTXO and trade with them. So that's one way of doing it. But even then, like you can only get to an amount that is as small as the minimum viable UTXO on the Bitcoin network. And if we're expecting fees to go up to like $10 or something, then that would be the minimum. Like, well, that wouldn't even be the minimum because you're at least paying that fee. So, with a $10 fee, maybe $100 UTXO is the minimum. So if I want to send you less than $100, this system really can't accommodate it. So the secondary way of doing it is, and this is actually kind of interesting, is that because you're trading UTXOs and you're kind of like really transferring the ownership of it, you can actually pre-spend the UTXO before it hits the blockchain. So if I have a 1 Bitcoin UTXO through a state chain, then I can already create a transaction that spends it. And that spending transaction can be kind of a Lightning open transaction. So I can create a Lightning channel while I have a Bitcoin on a state chain. And what this does is basically I give joint ownership of the coin on the state chain to my the party that I want to open a Lightning channel with, and then we have this actual Lightning off-chain transaction that basically just exactly how the Lightning Network works. So on both levels, on the level of the Lightning Network, the control is both, let's say, me and you if we have a channel, and on the state chain it's also me and you. And what that means is that we have a channel. I can so the example I gave before is right. I want to send you 0.1. So I take my 1 Bitcoin UTXO. I send it to you, but before I send it to you, we create a channel out of it. And 0.9 goes back to me, 0.1 goes to you. So then we essentially you have a Lightning channel on top of a state chain. And the interesting thing is that, let's say over time, eventually all the money is at your side. And then if we were on the Lightning Network in general, then we would have to kind of close the channel or have to try to rebalance it or something. But because we're on a state chain, as long as we're both in agreement, I can just sign over the entire UTXO to you. And now you can take the UTXO and you can do with it whatever you want. You can send it to anybody who also, is willing to participate in state chains. You can open a channel with somebody else. So it kind of creates another layer of where you can open and close channels as long as everybody's cooperative. And this really kind of gets a fundamental difficulty with the Lightning Network kind of out of the way, right? Because the opening and the closing of the channels, that is kind of where the friction is. And now you can do that off chain, provided that you are willing to accept the trust assumptions of a state chain.
Got it. So that's definitely one of the advantages that I think I originally kind of understood from state chains, is that, you could basically be doing scaling on top of scaling, because if we could, reduce the amount of open and closed channel transactions, that could definitely be advantageous.
Yeah.
How far do you think that it's likely to be taken in that way? Do you think let's say state chains become very common? Do you think that scenario would be a very common scenario that you kind of laid out there?
Yeah. So, you can do something similar on a sidechain like Liquid. But the advantage of doing it on a state chain is that you basically are lowering the trust assumptions. So I think the question of whether or not this is going to be used a lot really depends on, well, a couple of factors. Like, first of all, do we need more security than what a sidechain like Liquid provides? If the answer to that is yes, then maybe state chains are kind of that level up where it's secure enough to, because like, what are you secure against? Really, at the end of the day, it's government regulation. That's what could bring a sidechain like Liquid down. Maybe state chains is the better answer to that. So that would be the first kind of answer.
Got it. Okay. And then, if I'm understanding correctly, there is a future improvement to the Lightning Network called L2, and as I'm understanding it, that would give another big advantage to kind of the use of state chains and with the Lightning Network. Is that right?
Yeah. So actually, L2 is essential because we have this problem where what L2 does is it changes the model of the Lightning Network from a penalty model to kind of a model where you can overwrite transactions. So if you send an old state to the so we have a UTXO. There's one Bitcoin. I sent you 0.1. I sent you another 0.1. So now you have 0.2 and I have 0.8. Then I try to send a prior state where I had 0.1 and you had 0.9. Traditionally, what happens is you can take all the money, right? That's how the Lightning Network works today. But with L2, you can overwrite that state. So I'm sending a transaction to the Bitcoin blockchain that says you only get 0.1. Then you send your more updated transaction to the blockchain saying that you actually have 0.2. So it's a different model. And the reason that's necessary for something like state chains is because you have multiple owners. It's not just two people that have a channel. It is the money moving from, Alice to Bob to Carol to Dave. And they're all holders of kind of an off-chain transaction that could put a claim on the Bitcoins that are in the UTXO. If you don't have the update model, but you have the punishment model, then the question kind of becomes, well, who receives the benefit of the punishment? If the money goes from Alice to Bob to Carol, Alice cheats and Bob punishes, then Carol is screwed, but Carol had the money. So it kind of doesn't work out with a punishment model. So anytime you have more than two participants in a channel for whatever reason, whether it's state chains or Lightning channel factories, L2 is the way to go, and you can't use a traditional punishment model.
Got it. So kind of beyond those kind of points, are there any other advantages to using state chains with the Lightning Network?
Yeah, so I would say like kind of the best way of looking at it is that it really kind of solves the limitations of so they solve the limitations of each other, because with the Lightning Network, right, you have this problem of well, is there a channel, is there a route? And if there's not, then you have to open a new channel, and now you can kind of open that channel on a state chain. So you just stay off chain. And again, with the state chains, is the opposite problem. It's, well, you have one Bitcoin and you can really send it to anybody who is willing to trust the kind of the state chain model. But then, if you want to send less, if you want to divide that amount up, then you really need something like Lightning. So they've just really kind of worked together really well. And you can even do something like have a Lightning channel factory on a state chain, and it would kind of allow you to move participants in and out while remaining off chain. So things like that are really kind of desirable and useful. The only thing that needs to be mentioned is that it still relies on the same assumption that the Lightning Network functions on, which is that both parties cooperate. If one of them doesn't cooperate, then you are forced on-chain. And this is the same with state chains. So if you open a Lightning channel or a Lightning channel factory on a state chain and one of the participants stops participating, then your only option is to go on-chain.
Got it. So A piece of like FUD or, common misconception of the Lightning Network is that, in order to open up a channel for everyone on the planet or whatever, it would take, 100 years or something silly like that. Do you think that general concept is kind of moot, with state chains, the Lightning Network channel factories, things of that nature?
Yeah, so I think the question is kind of a red herring in the sense that we have no goal or obligation to get everybody on Earth on the Bitcoin blockchain on the Lightning Network. Like that's not a goal you can state. So I mean, opinions differ on this, and let me be clear and say that I would love for everybody to be on the Bitcoin blockchain, for everybody to have a Lightning channel. Like that is, it will make me so happy to see the technology achieve that level of use. But the reality is that the technology is inherently limited. And the limitation here that you're describing is the number of UTXOs that can be created per block. And that really doesn't change whether you use a state chain or you use the Lightning Network. And it's true that a Lightning channel factory or Lightning channel factory on a state chain, like it doesn't really matter. It's still like one UTXO. That helps, but you're still kind of, stuck with this problem that if one person stops cooperating, well, you have to go on chain. So really, yes, there is an inherent limitation, and I think it's not, you shouldn't think of it as we have to get everybody on the Bitcoin blockchain, otherwise Bitcoin fails. I think it's more of a us trying to get the best technology out there and make it scale as much as it possibly can and get as many people on board as possible. And there will be a limitation, and maybe 100 years from now, maybe then finally everybody can go on chain because computers are so fast that everybody can run a full node easily. Like we'll get there eventually. I don't think we should think of it as there being this goal of getting everybody on chain immediately. It really is just kind of us trying to make the technology as good as it can be, getting as many people as possible on board, and accepting that that's going to be limited inherently, and it's not going to reach everybody tomorrow. We'll get there someday, but probably not anytime soon, and that's just the reality. And you can desire for reality to be different. You can make trade-offs that kind of damage the fundamental thing that makes blockchains valuable in the first place to get your scaling, but I think that's very clearly the wrong trade-off. The only reason that Bitcoin is valuable in the first place is because it's this trustless system where I sent you a Bitcoin, the Bitcoin is now yours, nobody can say or do anything about it, and that comes with limitations inherently.
Got it. So I'm just going to take that kind of line of thought and just go down a tangent here, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
We've definitely had these kinds of arguments in Bitcoin for many years. That's where we got, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin SV, etc. Obviously, because you're in Bitcoin and you're kind of pursuing these kind of layer 2 solutions, I'm guessing you're not a proponent of larger blocks. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct. I don't think it's a very interesting thing to pursue because it really is a very simple trade-off, right? You're just taking a number and you're increasing it, and it's basically kind of saying like, hey, everybody in a network, go work harder so we can do more transactions. And you can say that once, you can say that twice, but eventually people are working as hard as they can, and they're just like, hey, I can't keep up. And it's like having a company and saying, okay, well, we're going to work from 8 hours. Now we're going to work 9 hours every day. Now we're going to work 10 hours every day. Eventually there's like a limit where people say like, okay, can't work here anymore. And so it's kind of simplistic. It doesn't really solve anything other than just making things a little bit bigger. But eventually you're going to run into these limits. And the only way of really getting around that, I think, is making these layer 2 trade-offs. And that's why I focus on that, and that's why that has my interest.
Understood. But would you say over a long enough timeline, do you think the block size will ever be changed, or are we sitting at 1 megabyte for forever?
Yeah, so I guess a more kind of meta point that I maybe should make is that I think there are a lot of people out there that are kind of like, have these maximalist tendencies of saying like, oh, the block size will never change it, and just being very kind of hardcore in their reasoning. I don't think that's realistic or reasonable. But that's kind of, I think, what happens on Twitter kind of naturally. So I would say a lot of the developers that I speak to, they don't have that mindset. They are just very conservative and cautious. And that means that you don't have any expectations, you don't have any promises, you don't say like, oh, we're definitely going to scale. Like there are lots of issues with actually increasing the block size. And the split that we saw with BCH, that's kind of one of the issues there, where sure, you can increase the block size, but well, good luck convincing other people to kind of agree with your block size increase. And that's literally what happened with BCH, where they did it, people didn't like it, and now they're stuck with a network that nobody's using. So, getting over that hurdle and convincing everybody to go along with your block size increase, that is not an easy thing to do. And, you can go around and you can blame the people for not switching because misinformation, blah, blah, blah. So that is really kind of one very difficult thing to do. And I think the only way we can get a block size increase in the future is if it is really, really obvious that we need it. And it's really dire, and we've talked about it a lot. You got to kind of wait until the last possible moment to get everybody to be on board with it, and that is really kind of one thing that's difficult about it. But very generally speaking, look, 20 years from now, computers are going to be so much better than they are today, and we're going to have the same block size limit. Like eventually, if not 20, then 40. It's going to eventually look silly to have the block size that we have today. It will take a long time. I don't think we're anywhere near having that issue. Yeah, eventually, I think we will get to a point where we got to think about maybe doing a hard fork, and whether or not that's going to be possible by the time, or whether through ossification, it just kind of becomes almost impossible, or maybe even we don't even have that problem anymore because layer 2 solutions are so incredibly good that the current limitation is actually sufficient. I mean, that's all impossible to tell. And I think the only kind of answer here is being open-minded and just moving into the future with a conservative mindset and slowly, considering the possibility, but always keeping in mind of how difficult it actually is to achieve. And and where we'll end up, like nobody can predict. And I think actually making those predictions is probably like a little bit of hubris, right? Because you just can't know.
Absolutely. I would probably agree with everything you said there. I probably want to kind of keep on this tangent here for another moment. Do you think, maybe kind of relating back slightly to state chains and the Lightning Network, do you think there will ever be a fee, a transaction fee that would be large enough to make kind of all of it just not work anymore, that it would just be too much for anyone to kind of, use layer 2 or anything, and everything just kind of falls apart?
I'm loving these tangents, by the way, so keep them coming. This is fun.
All right.
So I would say that's kind of, it's I mean, I guess the classic analogy is the restaurant is too popular, something like that, where sure, fees can be really high, but fees are only going to be high if there's somebody who's willing to pay them. So there's going to be a use case for them. And I think this goes back to scaling again, where if demand is so much higher than we have space for because of these inherent scaling limitations, then you're going to see really high fees. And that is really a popularity thing. If it's not popular, or because the fees are too high, people stop using it, well, the fees go down. So I think that would be a success in the sense that there apparently is a lot of demand for the block space that we do have, even though it's insufficient. So that is, I think, one potential future that, I think just could happen and needs to be accepted, in the sense that might be where the scaling limitations lead us. I don't want it. I would hope for everybody to be able to just transact as cheaply as possible forever, without any issues whatsoever, or security degradation. But one of the possible futures is really high fees that only rich people can afford. The blockchain will be useful for them, and the blockchain may not be as useful for the world, or maybe through layer 2 solutions, other people can still use it in a way that is sufficiently useful to them.
So do you think that there is a transaction fee that things are likely to kind of reach and stay at, or do you think it's just going to be a very variable kind of market there?
No, I mean, if I had to guess, I think fees are going to go up, and that's going to be a tough pill to swallow, I think, because people are not really feeling it right now, but once fees consistently become $10 or more, if we get to that, that's going to hurt. But to the level that it hurts, I think it also forces people to think more seriously about layer 2 solutions. So, that's generally, I think, how the world moves forward. You got to kind of experience a bit of pain for there to be progress. So I feel like it'll work itself out. And, I at least am thinking really deeply about having these alternate solutions for layer 2 in order to kind of have this secondary place where you can go. But even those layer 2 solutions, even something like Coinbase, right? Let's say we call Coinbase the ultimate layer 2 solution. Everybody should use it. Even if you do that, you still have the on-chain requirements, because if you literally cannot withdraw your coins from Coinbase because the transaction fee is so high that you can't pay it with the money that you have, that would be kind of a ridiculous example, but then your money isn't safe with Coinbase, because Coinbase can say like, look, I'm going to restrict this money. You can't use it freely anymore, or maybe even like remove the PEG altogether. And you have no recourse. You can't just get out and go back to the Bitcoin blockchain because the fees are too high. So it also affects layer 2 in that sense. Yeah, how that's going to work itself out, it's hard to say, but yeah, again, we just got to try our best to make it scale as far as we possibly can. I just think it's really important for people to not put their expectations too high, or have it, have this goal in mind where this many people have to use Bitcoin. It is a technology. It has limitations. Where it takes us, we don't know.
Got it. I'm kind of enjoying these tangents as well here. So if, let's say, fees kind of do go to the $10, how do you think, that would affect, state chains and the use of the Lightning Network? Do you think that would be a pretty big deal at that point?
Yeah, so I think what you end up needing is, I think the high level way of let's take Lightning, right? Like, I think the high level way of thinking about it is you're locking up a certain amount of coins and you get a certain level of transactions from it. Like, even if you lock up $100 on the Lightning Network, that $100 can move back and forth millions of times, theoretically. And, maybe you sent $1 million worth of value through that $100 UTXO. I mean, that would be unlikely, but if your UTXO, survives forever and you never go on chain, it's theoretically possible. So now, let's say you pay $10 for a $100 UTXO on the chain, and to close it again, you have to pay another $10. So you could say, okay, well, you're paying 20% of your money right there. But if you use it for 10 years and you manage to send $1 million through it, and received also $1 million, because otherwise you can't actually do it, well, then you pay $20 for $1 million of transactions, essentially. So that's one way in which it can be worth it. But, on the other side of the spectrum, you open your channel, the party you open it with leaves right away. You're forced to close the channel, and now you're out $20 of 100, and it really sucks. So yeah, that's it can kind of go both ways. And, maybe if that's kind of the scenario, people will be more cautious who they open their channel with, and, make sure that party is likely to cooperate with them. But yeah, that's about the way it will go.
Understood. So, I mean, like, I'm getting the impression that, if, fees went to $10, just for opening a Lightning transaction, we're likely to see a lot of innovation and a lot of businesses kind of being washed away. The ones that kind of are, doing like the one that comes to mind right now is Breeze, that kind of opens up a channel to every, user of their wallet just by default. So do you think we're likely to see a very different landscape at that point?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Like, look, I think Lightning today, it's very early. Like, even if we get like another bull market or something, and fees go up significantly because of all the arbitrage that people are going to perform, Lightning is going to suffer. And it's still early stages with Lightning, and people are still figuring it out. And I think those kinds of, I mean, you could call it an expected catastrophe. Like, it's going to happen. The Lightning Network is going to adapt, and people are going to use it differently after that happens. But eventually something will come out that is useful. Like, I think Lightning Network is just useful at every fee level. Even if we're at $100, it just means you have to open larger channels and you have to perform more financial transactions through it before it's worth it. But it's still a useful technology. So no matter where we go, no matter where the fees end up, Lightning is useful. Lightning is important. But you're right that the dream that people have of being able to have channels for everybody, having it be cheap always, there no friction. I would be very careful to hold that dream, because that is not something that's guaranteed at all. And I would say, that's one thing I worry about. And that looks very similar to, in 2014, like, people were thinking of, like, everybody's going to use Bitcoin for payments and all the shops are going to accept Bitcoin. And we kind of have a similar hope for the Lightning Network today that might not fully realize. And, if the fees skyrocket at some point, then all the people who believed that and thought that that was going to be a kind of a fact and it was promised to them, they're going to be disappointed. So I that's, again, like one of those things where I think it could lead to, another one of those BCH-like splits if people are too naive about that. We have no guarantees of where it's going to go. It might not be easy for you and your friends to buy a beer in the Lightning Network in the future. That might be difficult or complex or require a lot more work than people expect.
So I'm just going to ask one more kind of tangent question before we kind of go back around to state chains here. Kind of along that same line, do you see, the general FUD that kind of comes up is that it's going to become, the Lightning Network's going to become very centralized and everyone's going to use a custodial wallet? Do you think that there's a real danger of, things like this happening?
Well, it still works regardless of whether you are using custodial services. And I think it's very hard to predict what shape it's going to take, because the problem with using custodial not using custodial. Well, if you're literally using custodial service, well, then you're just using something like Coinbase, right? But if you're locking it up with some central third party and everybody's going through that same third party, well, that third party needs to put up a lot of capital actually in order to do that, because if everybody just opens channels, then there's no outgoing liquidity. So in that regard, I think the actual liquidity-wise, the most efficient shape of the network is actually a shape where the channels represent the flows of the money. So if that central party that everybody opens channels with, if they naturally would have received all that money, then it would make sense for them to kind of become a hub like that. But if that wasn't the case, then I don't think that's the most efficient shape. So you can think of it as, you go to work, your boss pays you once a month, so it makes sense for your boss and you to have a channel, and then maybe instead of paying you every month, he'll pay you every day, because that helps with liquidity in the Lightning Network. And then your boss is people that he's paying, so he's a channel with them. Then the person that your boss is paying, they own a shop and you go shopping there, so then you pay them through your boss. And that's kind of, I think, the most efficient way to use liquidity. And putting a third party in the middle there and having everybody connect to them, it makes things easier from a routing perspective. So it's kind of trading technical complexity for liquidity. And I think at the end of the day, if we get rid of all the technical complexity, or if we solve it all with good technology, then I'm tempted to say that we're going to see the more natural non hub model. But even with the hub model, even if there were just hubs, it's still a fact that you can close your channel and get your money back no matter what the hub does. So it might be kind of a privacy problem where the hub learns a lot of information. But in terms of trustless money, it's still trustless even if you go through a hub.
All right, absolutely. Let's go ahead and jump back to state chains here. Could you kind of give me an idea of what the major disadvantages state chains would have, maybe just in general or versus other layer 2 solutions?
Yeah, that's a great. I think it's important to really mention the downsides. So really it sits in the middle of sidechains and Lightning. Compared to Lightning, it is less trustless, right? It's not trustless. Lightning you can call trustless. I mean, depends on your definition of the word, but let's call it trustless. With state chains, it's a little bit closer to a sidechain in the sense that you have a federation. And if the federation really wants to screw you over, if all the members of the federation are saying like, Ruben, we're going to take your money, then they can get it done. They can make it happen. So there is a third party that at the end of the day can screw you over, but we're just limiting that to the most kind of difficult situation that's possible. So first of all, they don't even know they have my money. Second, if they want to take my money, they need literally, well, depending on how you want to set it up, you can set it up to a degree where literally everybody in the federation has to sign off on it. So even if one member of the federation says, no, I'm not screwing anyone over, then you're safe. And kind of a downside of having like a 100% like that is that if one member of the federation just disappears, then everybody's forced on chain. So, you might want to do like 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, something like that, just to make sure that at least, a couple of the federation members can disappear without everybody being forced on the Bitcoin blockchain. But, that's kind of, that's a better trade-off than what sidechains are doing, because with sidechains, you literally have, basically, if it's usually it's like a 6 or 7 out of 10, situation, and then if 4 people decide not to sign, then your money is basically frozen and you lose it. So that's it's roughly twice as secure, if you look at it in a very naive way. Yeah, so that's but still, like at the end of the day, the federation can take your money if they really want.
Got it. Okay. So I just maybe wanted to kind of ask a little bit more, it sounds to me like this is mostly theoretical for right now. Are there any kind of plans to actually implement state chains anytime soon?
Right. So first of all, I'm not a full-fledged developer, so I'm not going to be the one who will be implementing this. I've received a few requests to kind of come up with a description of how this would be built and what would be necessary, and kind of like have a minimal viable state chain, and then kind of like have things you can add to it to make it more fully fledged. So maybe I should go write up a document like that. But as for now, like the main limitation that we have is that it still requires a soft fork that enables L2. So if we don't have L2, then state chains don't work. There might be some alternate implementation. Maybe Liquid has like sufficient opcodes in order to make something like this work. So maybe like a demo implementation could be built on there, but I'm not even sure if that's true. So kind of as of right now, there's no actual place to build it. So that would be kind of the first step, that we get so-called SIG-hash no input, which is the requirement for L2.
Got it. Do you think we're likely to get SIG-hash no input?
Yeah, I think so. Now I would say we're still, like, everybody's focused on Schnorr and Taproot right now, so that's the first thing that's gotta go through. But already there's kind of a ongoing conversation on the Bitcoin Dev mailing list where people are discussing what really the downsides are of SIG-hash no input and how we can potentially implement it. And my feeling is that everybody wants it to go in, because it is a really kind of a fundamental improvement to have, if not state chains, at the very least, Lightning channel factories. So everybody wants it to happen, but just, I think there's a lot of discussion that still needs to happen in order for people to be really comfortable that we're getting the best possible solution with the least number of downsides. So that will take a while, I think. Just looking at how long Schnorr and Taproot took, right? We still don't have it implemented. So that's still, a way, it's going to be a while before we get that. And I would say we won't really, like, even though theoretically it's possible to do both soft forks just independently and implement them, I think the the developer attention won't fully go to it until we're kind of finished with Schnorr and Taproot. So it'll be a little while, I think, before we get there.
All right. So I kind of wanted to ask some kind of broader Bitcoin and Lightning questions here. But before we do you think there's anything about state chains that I've overlooked that you maybe wanted to finish explaining, or do you think we're good?
I guess one little tangent that I will just kind of hint at that I don't think we need to get into, but there's an interesting combination you can do with state chains and hardware security modules. So because you have this two key setup where one key is with the federation, it's a multi-sig, so it's multiple keys, but let's call it one key, and there's one key that's with the users. You can actually have a hardware security module that kind of manages that key. And what that does is it kind of adds to the security in the sense that as long as the hardware security module is secure, so what you can imagine two things. Like, let's say I want to send some money through a state chain to you. We can have kind of a, you have these little USB keys that you can give to people that have a private key inside.
Yeah,
do you remember the name of this? Opendime, thank you. Yeah. So I have one on my key ring, but I forgot the name. Yeah. So if you have an Opendime, you could have that be the second key. So I could physically give it to you. And the alternate method is something called remote attestation, which means that you kind of have a hardware device, I have a hardware device, and they talk to each other, and we transfer that second key through there. What that does is that as long as the hardware security is up to par and it doesn't break, then literally the Federation cannot cheat, even if they wanted to. And so it adds another layer of security. And what's interesting is that you still have this off-chain transaction system, which is important because if you rely fully on hardware security to move over keys, or if I give you the Opendime, if the Opendime breaks, the money is gone. But if you combine it with something like state chains, you still have this off-chain transaction. So the Opendime breaks, no problem. You just send your off-chain transaction to the Bitcoin blockchain and you get your money back. So that's kind of a cool little thing that you can do. That I think if you're a hardware manufacturer, you might be interested in.
All right, that's really cool. I didn't actually read about that one, so I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
All right, so I just kind of want to jump into kind of broader kind of Bitcoin and Lightning questions here.
Yeah, loving the questions. It's fun.
I like to kind of just ask, where do you see kind of Bitcoin going in the kind of short term here? So maybe like 5 years. What do you think it's going to look like?
Yeah, I think as fee pressure continues to mount, I think the layer 2 solutions are just going to be increasingly more important. And that is, I think, where more attention is going to go towards. And Lightning at the moment, obviously, is receiving a lot of attention already. So people are definitely building there, and that's really awesome to see. So yeah, I guess Lightning also will become more important. And I think what we're noticing in terms of development of Bitcoin Core is that I feel it's been slowing down compared to before, and that's probably a good thing. Anthony Towns had an interesting set of tweets about it, saying that, well, essentially, people are going to be more and more demanding of the security requirements of the code being up to par. People really whether they have thought it through, and we're seeing that with Schnorr and Taproot, where people are really being increasingly careful. So I think that's really kind of a sign that we are, I think, very slowly, just incrementally slowing down development by being more demanding of making sure every new change is really secure and safe. And that is kind of moving us towards ossification very, very slowly. We'll just see, I don't think we'll see like, okay, tomorrow we're going to stop making any changes, but I think we're going to continue to see changes rolling out more and more slowly. And that's also why, I was saying earlier on that SIG no input might take a while, because I think that's kind of the trend.
Got it. So I'm just going to keep going through these kind of questions. I'm not going to probably probe too deep at this point, since I feel like we're kind of running a little bit longer than I expected.
Yeah, sure.
A question that I kind of like to ask a lot is, how do you think, we as Bitcoiners, whatever that means, how do we help to kind of stimulate the closed loop or circular economy? How can we make that a reality sooner than later?
Yeah, so you mean like having actual places where you can pay with Bitcoin and have it kind of move, right? Like through the economy in a way that's more natural than just speculation.
Yeah, so maybe I'll kind of just lay out exactly what I think that means. So, here in the United States, there's stores where you can buy marijuana in certain states. I kind of envision, they accept Bitcoin for purchasing the marijuana. They, pay their vendors in Bitcoin, and maybe they even pay their employees in Bitcoin. And so, people wouldn't have to necessarily sell their Bitcoin. They would just use it, they get paid it, it just keeps going in a circle. And that's, how I would kind of lay it out there.
Yeah. So I think the best way of thinking about that is like every step of the way, just asking the question, does it make sense for them to use Bitcoin? And if it doesn't, then why not? And then thinking about whether or not that's going to change. So I think when you're talking about a transaction that's illegal or a transaction that's gray and is likely to get you into trouble with banking partners, like, I know some marijuana dispensers, they're having trouble having bank accounts, then the answer is kind of, yes, okay, I want to accept Bitcoin for payments because I know it's kind of a better alternative, cash or Bitcoin. Okay, great. And then secondly is, well, the people that work there, do they don't want cash or do they want Bitcoin? And there I'm thinking, well, would you really, like we're all Bitcoiners, we like Bitcoin, we like to buy Bitcoin, so therefore we wouldn't mind getting paid in Bitcoin, but that's still speculation, right? You want to buy it to hold it for the future. So the only way you would want to accept Bitcoin as payment for your work is if you want to be kind of a speculator, or if you have trust that Bitcoin is going to do well in the future. And that's not really kind of a natural, that's still kind of speculation. So I think it's inevitable that until we get to a point where somebody just says like, hey, yeah, sure, Bitcoin, fiat, I don't care, or I slightly prefer Bitcoin because it's a little bit less inflationary. Sure, I'll take Bitcoin. And then they go, somewhere else and they spend it. Like until we get to that point, it's just going to be speculation. It's going to be speculation all the way. And I think that's just inevitable. So trying to force that loop or trying to ask people to do that, I think if it doesn't make sense for them, it's just not going to happen. So I think Bitcoin just needs to grow. Bitcoin needs to be held by more people. It needs to get increasingly stable. And then, slowly it just becomes more convenient where you say like, okay, I get paid in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is stable enough, so I don't really mind. Or, there will be use cases that are a little bit more illegal, or there's a little bit more friction. Like, if you're trying to send money to the other side of the world, well, if you use banking, maybe you have to pay, $20 to $50. So you get rid of that through Bitcoin. And I think we'll just slowly get to a point where finally Bitcoin is so useful that everybody just thinks of it as money. But this will be a slow process, and I think it will be largely preceded by speculation.
All right. I think I would probably agree with all of that. So I want to ask kind of, broad questions about Lightning here before we wrap up. Have you used Lightning much yourself, kind of on a personal basis?
I mean, I've played around with it. I wouldn't say it is quite like... I mean, the thing that I find difficult is that there's still a lot of routing issues and it's still very experimental. So I think it's fun to play around with, but it doesn't really strike me as ready for main use. And I think that's going to take many years. So for me, it's just kind of fun and experimental, but I don't think it's like super, ready for primetime use. But one of the things that I've been kind of wanting to do, and we used to do at the meetup, is we had this basically we would go for dinner after the meetup, and then one person would pay in fiat, and then everybody else would pay that person in Bitcoin. And we kind of stopped doing that after the bubble and the fees going up. So everybody was kind of like, yeah, that's not really viable anymore. And then after that, it just kind of feels wrong to do when you know that fees will go up in the future. So it's just like, why? Yes, it's possible now in the Bitcoin blockchain, but will it really be possible in the future? And I guess I feel kind of similar about Lightning, where I'm just a little hesitant to get excited about it, because I feel like we have this similar issue coming. But yeah, I think I would like to kind of find a way to have like me and my fellow Bitcoiners here to have a little closed loop circled economy of Lightning routes where we pay each other after having dinner. So I would like to kind of like get to that point. And so far, I don't know if you have any recommendations of a wallet that makes it particularly easy. The one that I've seen that makes it easy is kind of, custodial. So that didn't really seem appealing to me. But yeah, I'm sure we're getting close to that point. But I still don't think it's quite that easy to achieve. What do you think?
I mean, I think I might be kind of biased. I do host a podcast called Lightning Junkies, so I think I'm a little biased. And
Sure, yeah.
a couple weeks ago, I had gone to the Lightning conference in Berlin, and it was like I was transported to a different universe where Lightning is used by everyone, and everyone has it, and
Yep.
Buy cocktails, buy beer, buy ice cream with Lightning.
Yep.
And that felt very magical, and it had all these, kind of reminded me of Bitcoin in 2013, 2014, when everyone was using it at, various merchants
Yep.
and thinking that was going to keep on going, like you were kind of saying
Yeah.
earlier. But I guess my question, kind of follow up would be, you're kind of touching on some reasons to be skeptical of the Lightning Network.
Yeah.
Do you have any other ones that you would want to kind of throw out there that you kind of that are a real kind of sticking point for you?
No, I mean, I think I've made my points to a fault almost, right? Like I like the excitement is real, and I think it's good to have that excitement. And it is really cool. And I've organized Lightning hackathons here and done little projects where people, create little apps. I've created an app of my own even, which is like a little chat room where it's called Limit Chat, where basically you have to pay some money to send a message, and it's kind of spam control, because if you wait 10 minutes, the price will go down again. But if you try to send another message before the 10 minutes are up, you kind of have to pay more. And if you continue to do that, you have to pay more and more and more. So it's kind of like a chat room that's limited in payments. That was a fun little project to do, and I used OpenNode, I think, which is basically kind of they run a Lightning node for you, so it kind of makes it easy. But it definitely was fun to do, and I do think it's good to kind of stimulate people to think about that. I kind of just want both, right? I want people to be excited and work on it and do these cool things, but I also want them to know that the thing that you're doing, like you go there and you spend money, you buy things with Lightning, you get a glimpse of the future, but that future is far away. We're not there. It's going to take a long time. And if you think next year it's going to be the time when everybody's doing this, like you're going to be disappointed, and that's not good either, right? So be excited, but know that we're still a long way out.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I want it to be here tomorrow, I definitely realize that there's still a good amount of issues in Bitcoin and Lightning. I think Bitcoin definitely works and all that, but there's a lot of things that really need to be worked on in order for my friends that generally don't care about these things to actually care about these things.
Yep.
So I kind of remember the questions I had before. So you were kind of asking me, is there a wallet that you might recommend to make it easy? I really like Breeze Wallet. They're not a sponsor or anything like that, but I definitely feel like they're not custodial. The only kind of maybe trade-off is that they open up a million sat channel to you directly, so they serve as a kind of centralized hub in some sense. So that might be a trade-off. But I think for what it is, I think it's really good. It kind of gives you most of the control and everything, and most people probably aren't going to be doing transactions over that limit. They're gonna be going on to y'all's, or there might be sending back $20 here and there, etc. So I think that might be kind of up your alley to serve the function that you were talking about.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think I gotta sit down and think about that, because like you said, right, you're using a hub. It's not really it's kind of forcing the Lightning Network to work in a way that, yeah, sure, it works like that, but it doesn't scale like that, right? Like it's not like everybody can have the channel with the Breeze server, and and it's gonna inevitably fail, right? So, but yeah, I do agree. It's a trustless setup, and it works, and it's definitely better than doing something that's just fully custodial, because like there's also a couple of wallets out there that are like, they run the the Lightning hub for you, and then I mean, that just kind of seems a little weird, right? Then you're really back to the Coinbase model.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to claim that I don't use a custodial wallet sometimes. Like I definitely run my own LND node
Yeah.
for actually routing, but I did find myself using the wallet of Satoshi at the Lightning conference just because it was kind of low bandwidth and it just kind of it's worked faster. So
Yeah.
unfortunately, kind of had to cheat a little bit there.
Yeah, right. But well, again, like it's good to see and feel the future. Like as long as you're just aware of what you're doing, I think it's absolutely fine. One other thing that I guess I'm a little like I need to think about this a little bit more. But a lot of these wallets they're light clients, and they use Neutrino in order to sync with the server. And I do think, like, Luke Jr. made some comments about that. That is not, a fully trustless wallet if you're not connecting to your own full node. So I think that's kind of like another one of those questions, I guess, that I have is like, well, how much are you trusting someone if you don't connect it to your own full node? But I guess that's that's also where we're moving towards, where people can just and that's pretty cool. I think like you just throw a Raspberry Pi in the corner of your room, you have it connected, and your phone connects to that, and that seems to be kind of like a way through that.
Yeah, absolutely. Either a Raspberry Pi, a Casa, a Nodal. I definitely like those products. I definitely feel like that's the future. We're going to get a lot more of the kind of hardware products out there.
So one thing I guess I can mention is that there's a recent mailing list post that I made about so-called proof of work fraud proofs. And this is kind of an idea that actually connects to Lightning indirectly, because you guys, or the Lightning people in general, there's a lot of light client work out there, and proof of work fraud proofs are actually kind of a way to enhance SPV nodes. So if you're an SPV wallet, what you're doing is you're trusting kind of the most proof of work. And proof of work fraud proofs are kind of a way to reject proof of work when it's invalid. So let's say you have 90% of all miners creating a block that is not actually correct. Then if you're an SPV wallet, you're just going to follow it because it's the most proof of work. And with proof of work fraud proofs, what you're doing is basically you will see that minority miner, that remaining 10%, create a block, and that will kind of prompt you to recognize that maybe the block that 10% is rejecting, because they're forking off, maybe that block is invalid, and it's kind of a method to then download and verify that block, and that makes it possible to, even though you run a light client, to reject the most proof of work, and that makes SPV nodes safer. It's still not a replacement for a full node, but that's a little bit of interesting tech if there are any people that are working on wallets and they're interested in light clients.
Absolutely. I think I'm going to end up having to listen to that explanation again to really kind of grok it. I feel like it's getting slightly late here, so my mind is not picking up everything that I wanted to pick up at the moment.
For sure. Yeah, and it's a bit techy also. I recommend just reading the mailing list post. I don't know if you have any show notes, but maybe we can put a link there for the listeners.
Yep, absolutely. I'll definitely throw that into the show notes once I work on this here. All right. I think I'm kind of reaching the end here. I typically
Yep.
try to keep these to about an hour, and we're kind of approaching an hour and a half.
We are, yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead and let the listeners know how they can, find you, and maybe how to maybe find any other explanations about state chains?
Yeah, so I have on my Twitter account, which is at Somsen Ruben, SOMSENRUBEN. I have a pinned tweet with links to all my state chain talks, the paper, the Medium post that you mentioned before we started the show. I've given presentations at Scaling Bitcoin Tokyo, at Breaking Bitcoin in Amsterdam. So those two presentations are there about state chains. So check those out. And there's also, I think, a write-up of one of the core dev meetings So that's a little bit more technical, but that might be interesting too. So check out those links. And and other than that, go listen to Unhashed Podcast, unhashedpodcast.com. It's a fun little show where, it's a little bit more bantery, but, I talk technical stuff there too. So if you're interested in that, go check it out.
Well, I really appreciate you joining me on the Lightning Junkies podcast. This has probably been much more of a conversational podcast. I'm not usually used to doing that. I'm still kind of new to this whole thing. But I really appreciate you joining me on the podcast tonight.
Yeah, no, I thought it was fun. I thought you asked some good questions. Like, it's nice to, I guess, like as a somebody who comes on the show, like, I was prepared to talk about state chains, but it's good that you gave a bunch of questions about like just general Bitcoin stuff. And I think that's also good to kind of get more opinions of people who are working on these things. I think the real advantage of podcasts in general is that you have a little bit more time and space to give nuance, because if you go on Twitter, everybody has these short little quips about like Lightning is going to be amazing, solve everything, and even though they don't think that, that's all they get to say, because that's Twitter. So like these kinds of podcasts I think are great for people to just kind of give a little bit more of an explanation of what they really think. So I thought that was great. You asked a lot of good questions.
So what you're saying is Lightning is literally a panacea and will solve all the issues, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. Thank you for, you can quote me on that. Yeah, that's exactly what I meant.
Right. All right, man. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I really appreciate you joining me, man. It was great.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks a lot.
Boom. That was a lightning strike of an episode. Okay, that was a kind of a dorky thing to say, but I definitely feel like this was a really good episode. I think I learned quite a lot, and I had a really good time, just talking about different subjects and, learning a lot of things here. If you learned anything from this particular episode, once again, I would please ask that you contribute to my crowdfunding campaign, crowdfund.lightningjunkies.net. Once again, if you chip in more than 100,000 sats, I will be throwing in a Lightning Junkie sticker. If you're unable to financially support the show, I would definitely ask that you subscribe and post a review on the relevant podcasting platform that you might be using, as well as share the show on social media. That would help me tremendously as well. But with that, I am going to end the show, so I'll see you on the Lightning Network.